This portion of the lecture series is going to continue with period 2, which remember that period 2 is from the 1450s until the 1750s. And also this time period is known as Old Imperialism, meaning this is the first round of imperialism that we see Europe go through, first with imperializing the New World, the Americas, and then new imperialism comes in period 3, when we see Europeans and their countries scrambling for colonization in Africa. But we're not at period 3 yet, so we're going to focus on period 2. Now, the last lecture that we covered, we focused predominantly on the Americas, and so we're going to shift to still talking about old imperialism, but instead talking about how it went down in Africa, or the causes and effects of old imperialism in Africa. So in terms of historical thinking skills that we're going to cover, the main ones that we're going to focus on are causation. So cause and effect. What were the causes of Africa's role in old imperialism? What were the effects of Africa's role? And then also continuity and change over time. What continued in Africa and what changed. Also, we're not just looking at these historical thinking skills in Africa alone. We're also looking at how it changes and continues things, has causes and effects across the world, not just in the African continent. So like always, the first step that we're going to do is we're going to go over context, so contextualization. So background information, we're reviewing period 1. Now remember, period 1, our curriculum starts at the year 1200, but we do a little context for period 1 as well. So we're just going to go ahead and go back to the 600s where we have the end of the Bantu migrations. Due to the Bantu migrations, we have the spread of the banana from Madagascar that leads to a population boom. We also have the spread of the Bantu language and the spread of Bantu culture, including the spread of malaria, which is going to be a factor in why the Europeans in old imperialism aren't successful in trying to invade the interior of Africa. Also, we have the increase of trade in Africa, primarily through the Saharan Desert route, the Trans-Saharan Desert route. Now, one of the effects of that Trans-Saharan Desert trade is the spread of Islam, because it's primarily Islamic merchants that are using that trade route. Also, as a result of trade in Africa, you get cultural diffusion, meaning like the spread of Islam, that is an example of culture, that is a religion, as well as new technology that is spreading. Remember that the camel made the Trans-Saharan Desert route feasible, and we're also going to see old world technology in the form of guns and gunpowder and cannons be spread during the Pax Mongolica. Okay, now the last empire that we had talked about in period 1 was the Empire of Mali, which is here along the western coast. It includes areas like Timbuktu and the city Gao. Remember that those were famous Islamic centers of learning. Well, the Mali Empire falls to the Songhai Empire, and the Songhai Empire doesn't rule for that long. They rule for about 100 years before they fall. So same thing with like the Mongols, where the Mongols didn't last particularly long. The Songhai Empire isn't going to last particularly long. Also, if you see this spelled with an I instead of a Y, okay, that's also acceptable. So you may see 2 of those different spellings. It's just based on how it sounds. So the Songhai were the main ethnic group in Gao, which was the famous center of Islamic learning. They helped preserve Greco-Roman antiquity as well as new innovations throughout period 1. But they're also going to expand to conquer Gao as well. Okay, so by the 15th century, and remember 15th century means 1400s, Gao gained its independence, and then eventually one of the Songhai rulers, Sunni Ali, is going to rise to power by conquering other areas and grow larger and larger. Okay, so he's actually going to be the one who is credited with conquering Timbuktu, which, remember, in addition to being a center of Islamic learning, is also a center of trade, meaning that it makes a lot of money. Okay, now he is Muslim, but he's not particularly devout. He's Muslim because, everyone in Africa during this time is Muslim due to the cultural diffusion of Islam along the Saharan trade routes. So he's not really devout. He's very anti-scholar. In fact, under his rule, you get repressive policies. So he was repressive and he was anti-scholar. And we know that Typically in Islamic caliphates, they're very pro-scholar with the foundations of madrasas and other universities in order to promote learning. So that's a little bit of like an exception there of, okay, yeah, he wasn't very devout to his Muslim faith. And one of the signs of that is, well, look at how anti-scholar he was, which is not what we typically see in Islamic rulers. Now, his nephew, now remember that this is a matrilineal society, so it's not his son who takes over. Instead of Sunni Ali's son taking over, his nephew, Askia, takes over, Askia Muhammad. He is kind of like the Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire. Okay, so he's the Mansa Musa of the Songhai. So Askia the Great was the nephew of Ali, and he expanded the empire, making it larger. But he was also a devout Muslim, so he bolstered Islam. He built schools and churches, much like Mansa Musa did, in order to expand Islam in his empire. Also, he was tolerant of other faiths. So the opposite, essentially, of what Sunni Ali was doing. Now, like Mansa Musa, Askia the Great was also very wealthy. You have to understand that there was a lot of money coming through that trans-Saharan trade. But also, in addition to money coming through or wealth being generated by that Saharan trade, you also have the influx of guns. And that's going to be a huge topic that we talk about with the Columbian Exchange and its impact in Africa. So again, here's just a blow-up map of what the Songhai Empire looked like. They conquer Gao, then they take over Timbuktu, and they expand over the empire that was formerly known as Mali. Now, with the Columbian Exchange, we've seen this slide before. Remember that you're responsible for knowing the legs of the triangular trade, 1, 2, and 3, as well as what goods were transported on these legs. Now, the big factor in the Columbian Exchange for Africa is going to be the influx or the arrival of guns into the continent. Okay, that is going to be hugely disruptive to the mighty African empires. Also, of course, the transatlantic slave trade is going to have a huge demographic effect, a huge negative demographic effect on the Africans. But also you get some goods from the Americas which help in Africa, like the arrival of cassava, which is going to be a crop that grows very well in Africa and leads to a population boom, much like the potato leads to a population boom in Europe, and the banana from the Indonesian seafarers back in the 500s led to a population boom among the Bantu people. So when do the Europeans start arriving in Africa? Well, they arrive in the late 15th century. Okay, remember that's the 1400s. Prince Henry the Navigator, through his school for navigation, is going to fund expeditions to finance a route to India and to explore along the western coast of Africa. Remember that they can't invade Africa and get into the interior because the Africans have the same military technology. They are a part of the old world. Also, the Europeans lack an immunity to malaria. Okay, now eventually the discovery of quinine in the New World is going to treat malaria, and that's when we'll get new imperialism in period 3 with the Europeans in Africa, but we're not there yet. Okay, so Henry the Navigator financed this route to India and this route for exploration around the western coast of Africa. And so he establishes these trading posts along the coast. And so what are they going to trade in these trading posts? Well, the Europeans are going to bring manufactured goods. Guns, gunpowder, cannons. They're going to bring manufactured goods like alcohol and also, of course, just gold and silver that they've gotten from the New World, that bullion, right? So let me put that under Columbian Exchange here. So we can't forget how much of that wealth was generated from the New World into the Old World. In exchange for all those goods, the African kingdoms along the western coast are going to export, like their main exports are ivory and gold, but also they have the exports of slaves. Okay, now remember that old world slavery is different from what we're going to see in new world slavery with the transatlantic slave trade. So we're going to actually cover that in a few slides. So one of the explorers that Henry the Navigator, or at least the Portuguese, funded was Vasco da, with an A, Gama. Remember that in 1498 he completed his route around the coast of Africa But in addition to finding that route to the spice trade, to the Indian Ocean trade, he also invaded the Swahili coast. So this area right here on the eastern coast of Africa, which remember was booming for trade. So whereas they cannot invade the interior of Africa, instead the Europeans are going to stay along the coastlines. So Vasco da Gama invades Swahili for Indian Ocean access, and this is going to lead to the decline of the region. Due to Portuguese invasion, the Swahili states are going to decline. In our next video, when we get back, I'm going to cover the transatlantic slave trade and the differences between Old World slavery and New World slavery before we move on to the African diaspora.